Here is a question that sounds simple, but isn't. How far into the future do you think? Most people, if they're being honest, think maybe a few years ahead. A pay raise, a mortgage, a retirement account, perhaps a child's college fund. The horizon of practical human planning, the distance most of us actually project our decisions into, is roughly 10 to 20 years. Beyond that, the future becomes abstract, theoretical, not really ours. Now consider this. There are families in the world who are making decisions today based on what they want to be true 150 years from now. Families who maintain forests they will never harvest because the timber will be valuable to their great-great-grandchildren. Families whose investment portfolios are structured around a 50-year return horizon. Families who choose which charities to support based on which institutions they believe will still be relevant in the 22nd century. Families who are, in a very literal sense, living in a different relationship with time than the rest of us. This is not a metaphor. It is a documented, studied, and in many ways deeply strange feature of how old money thinks, a temporal orientation so different from the default human experience that it might as well be a different cognitive mode entirely. And once you understand it, once you see how differently old money experiences and uses time, you will never look at wealth or legacy or even your own daily decisions the same way again. This is the strange way old money thinks about time. Two kinds of time. To understand old money's relationship with time, we first need to understand that there are, broadly speaking, two fundamentally different ways that human beings and human institutions relate to time. Anthropologists, economists, and psychologists have studied this extensively, and the distinction maps remarkably well onto the difference between old money and almost everyone else. The first mode is what we might call transactional time. The experience of time as a series of discrete, immediate exchanges. You work, you get paid. You invest, you expect a return. You make a decision, you evaluate its outcome. Transactional time is short, iterative, and outcome-focused. It is the dominant temporal mode of modern consumer culture, of quarterly earnings reports, of social media engagement, of most political thinking. Transactional time asks, what is happening right now and what will happen next? The second mode is what we might call generational time, the experience of time as a slow river flowing across lifetimes, in which the individual is not the primary unit of meaning, but rather a single link in a long chain. Generational time is long, accumulative, and identity-focused. It asks not what is happening now, but what are we becoming, and what will we leave? Old money, by definition, wealth that has persisted across multiple generations, operates almost entirely in generational time. And this is not simply a philosophical preference. It is a survival strategy. Families that operated only in transactional time did not remain wealthy across generations. They consumed what they had, optimized for the present, and were gone. The families that remain are those that, somewhere in their cultural DNA, made the shift to generational time, and passed that orientation down as carefully as they passed down the assets themselves. The economist and philosopher Nassim Nicholas Taleb, in his work on anti-fragility, touches on this distinction when he describes the difference between fragile systems that optimize for short-term efficiency and anti-fragile systems that sacrifice short-term optimization for long-term robustness. Old money is, almost by definition, anti-fragile in its temporal structure. It accepts present-tense constraints, living modestly relative to one's means, maintaining illiquid assets, foregoing consumption, in exchange for compounding resilience across time. But where does this orientation come from? Is it taught? Is it absorbed? Is it structural, built into the legal and financial instruments around which the family organizes itself? The answer is all three, and understanding how it works requires going deeper into each layer. The dead hand, how old money, literally institutionalizes the past. One of the most remarkable, and from certain perspectives, most disturbing, features of old money's relationship with time is the degree to which the past exercises literal legal and financial control over the present. In legal history, this is sometimes called the dead hand problem, the tendency of wealthy individuals to structure their estates in ways that bind the behavior of their descendants long after the original wealth creator has died. The Latin phrase is mortmain, literally dead hand, and it has been a source of legal and philosophical controversy for centuries. Here is how it works in practice. A dynasty founder creates a trust, a legal structure that holds assets and governs how they are managed and distributed. The trust document specifies conditions. Assets may not be sold for a certain period. Distributions may only be made at certain ages or under certain circumstances. Assets must be used for certain purposes. In the most elaborate versions, dynasty trusts, which we touched on in our previous video, these constraints can extend for generations. In states like South Dakota and Delaware, which have abolished the traditional legal limit on trust duration, a trust created today can, in theory, govern the behavior of your descendants in the year 2200. Think about what that means. A person alive today making decisions based on their values, their vision, their understanding of the world, can legally bind people who are not yet born to structures they had no say in creating. The dead hand reaches forward through time and shapes the choices of the living. Old money families have been doing this for centuries. The English aristocracy developed entail, a legal mechanism that prevented heirs from selling inherited land, specifically to prevent the fragmentation we discussed earlier. Land held in entail could not be sold by the current holder. It passed intact to the next generation, regardless of the current holder's wishes or needs. This is the system that forms the backdrop of Jane Austen's novels. The reason the Bennet family in Pride and Prejudice faces such anxiety is that Mr. Bennet's estate is entailed to a male heir, meaning his daughters cannot inherit it. The dead hand of a long-ago legal arrangement is shaping the lives of people who had no part in creating it. In America, the Rockefeller family's trust structures, established in the early 20th century, have governed the distribution of Rockefeller wealth across 6 generations. The original trust documents, written by lawyers working for John D. Rockefeller himself, contain provisions that remain legally operative today, more than a century after they were drafted. Descendants of Rockefeller live within a financial and legal framework, designed by a man most of them never met, making decisions that continue to shape their options, their obligations, and their identity. This is old money's most concrete expression of its temporal philosophy, the belief that the past is not merely history, but an active participant in the present, that the founder's judgment deserves to persist. That continuity is a value worth institutionalizing, even at the cost of individual freedom. Critics of this approach, and there are many, argue that it is fundamentally undemocratic, that no individual should have the right to bind the choices of future generations who cannot consent. The philosopher John Rawls and legal scholar John Rawls Both grappled with the justice implications of intergenerational wealth transfer. Thomas Jefferson, strikingly, argued in correspondence with James Madison that no law should bind future generations, that constitutions and debts should expire after 19 years, the rough span of an adult generation. Jefferson's position never became law, and old money has been grateful for that ever since. But the dead hand is not only a financial mechanism, it is also a cultural one. Old money families transmit their temporal orientation, their sense of obligation to the past and responsibility to the future, through stories, rituals, and explicit teaching. The portrait gallery in the family home is not merely decoration. It is a daily reminder that you are part of a chain. The annual family gathering at the ancestral house is not merely a reunion, it is a ritual reenactment of continuity. The family motto, often in Latin, inscribed on a crest that appears on stationery and silverware and gates, is a compressed temporal statement. This is what we have always stood for, and what we will always stand for. The 50-year investment horizon. Perhaps the most practically consequential expression of old money's temporal philosophy is its approach to investment, specifically the radically extended time horizons that characterize old money portfolio management. The default investment horizon for most individual investors is somewhere between 5 and 20 years. Pension funds, considered long-term institutional investors, typically plan over 20 to 30-year horizons. But old money family offices, the private investment management firms that handle dynastic wealth, routinely operate on 50-year, 100-year, or even explicitly multi-generational horizons. What does this change? Almost everything. When your investment horizon is 5 years, volatility is your enemy. A sharp market correction is a crisis. It reduces your portfolio's value precisely when you may need to draw on it. You optimize for stability and liquidity. When your investment horizon is 50 years, volatility is largely irrelevant. A market correction that wipes out 30% of portfolio value in a single year is, on a 50-year horizon, a minor event, statistically certain to be recovered and exceeded within a decade. You can optimize not for stability, but for long-run compounding, which looks completely different. Long-run compounding rewards asset classes that are illiquid, volatile, and deeply unfashionable in the short term, but structurally sound over decades. Timberland, agricultural land, private equity in industries with 50-year tailwinds, infrastructure, endowments in institutions that will compound in relevance and value over generations. The Weyerhaeuser family, one of America's great timber dynasties, has held forest land for over a century. Land that appreciates slowly, produces modest annual income, and cannot be quickly liquidated, but that has compounded in value across generations in a way that no stock portfolio could match over the same period. This is patient capital, capital that is deliberately structured to be long-term because its managers have a genuinely long-term horizon. The endowment model, pioneered by Yale University under David Swensen and studied by wealth managers worldwide, is essentially an institutional expression of old money temporal philosophy. Yale's endowment, which has produced some of the highest long-term returns of any investment pool in history, achieves this partly through a massive allocation to illiquid alternative assets. Private equity, timber, real estate, venture capital. These assets would be catastrophic in a portfolio that needed liquidity in the short term. In a portfolio managed with a perpetual horizon, they are extraordinarily powerful. Old money families understood this intuitively, long before Swenson formalized it. The great European aristocratic families who held agricultural land for centuries were, in effect, running the endowment model centuries before it had a name. The land produced income, appreciated slowly, could not be easily sold, sometimes by legal constraint, sometimes by cultural norm, and compounded across generations into something far more valuable than any liquid investment of comparable scale. There is another dimension to the long investment horizon that is less often discussed: the willingness to be wrong for a very long time. Short-term investors cannot afford to be wrong for a decade. If your investment thesis takes 10 years to play out, you will lose your clients, your mandate, and possibly your job long before the thesis is vindicated. Old money investors can afford to be wrong for a decade, because a decade is a small fraction of their relevant time horizon. This means they can hold positions, maintain convictions, and absorb short-term losses in service of long-term conclusions in ways that are institutionally impossible for almost any other kind of investor. This temporal patience is, in financial terms, genuinely one of the most powerful competitive advantages available to any investor, and it is available only to those who have genuinely internalized generational time, who experience a decade not as an eternity, but as a rounding error. Raising children for a future. They won't live to see old money's temporal orientation doesn't only affect investment decisions. It profoundly shapes how dynasties think about raising the next generation, producing child-rearing philosophies that are, by mainstream standards, deeply unusual. The core challenge of dynastic child-rearing is this: you are trying to prepare a child not for the world as it is, but for the world as it will be in 40 or 50 years, and simultaneously for a role that connects them to a world that existed 40 or 50 years ago. The dynastic heir must be simultaneously forward-looking and backward-rooted. They must carry the past and inhabit the future. This produces some of the most distinctive features of old money education. The emphasis on classics over currency. Old money families have historically shown a pronounced preference for classical education, Latin, Greek, ancient history, philosophy, rhetoric, over practically oriented modern education. This has often been dismissed as snobbery, and sometimes it is. But there is a deeper temporal logic. Classical education is education in permanence, in the things that have remained relevant across thousands of years. A family that thinks in generational time is naturally drawn to knowledge that has demonstrated its value over centuries. Homer, Thucydides, Cicero. These writers have been considered essential for 2,000 years. The curriculum trending today may be irrelevant in 20 years. Old money bets on the long proven over the newly popular. This is why schools like Eton, Harrow, Phillips Exeter, and St. Paul's have maintained curricula with strong classical components long after the practical utility of Latin has become negligible in the working world. They are not preparing students for jobs. They are preparing them for durability, for the capacity to navigate an uncertain future using frameworks that have proven resilient across centuries. Delayed gratification as a core value. One of the most deliberately cultivated values in old money child rearing is the capacity for delayed gratification, the ability to forego present consumption in favor of future benefit. This is taught explicitly and modeled consistently. Old money households are notoriously not lavish by the standards of their actual wealth. Children raised in dynastic families are frequently surprised and sometimes the source of their friends' bewilderment, by how modest the domestic culture is relative to the family's net worth. The house is grand, but the furniture is old and not replaced. Clothing is quality, but not ostentatious. Vacations are taken, but not in the most expensive resorts. Money is not discussed freely or deployed casually. This is not accidental. It is pedagogical. The children are being taught by daily experience that wealth is not for consumption. It is for stewardship. That the appropriate relationship to money is not spending, but holding, not enjoying, but protecting. That pleasure in the present is less important than security in the future. Developmental psychologists have documented the long-term advantages of delayed gratification, most famously in Walter Mischel's Stanford marshmallow experiments, which found that children who could delay gratification at age 4 showed significantly better life outcomes at 18 and beyond. Old money understood this intuitively. The cultural emphasis on restraint, patience, and deferred reward is not puritanical self-denial. It is a sophisticated preparation for the kind of long-horizon thinking that dynastic stewardship requires. Teaching identity across time. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of old money child rearing is the deliberate cultivation of what we might call temporal identity, a sense of self that is explicitly located within a long historical narrative. Old money children are taught, from an early age, who they are in relation to who came before them. The family history is told, the founder's story, the pivotal moments, the challenges survived, the values established. The portraits in the family home are identified. The graves in the family plot are visited. The letters and journals of ancestors are, in many families, preserved and made accessible. The child is given, in effect, a temporal autobiography. Not just who you are, but where you come from and where you are going. This is qualitatively different from the generic advice to know your history. It is an active, ongoing construction of the child's identity as a point in a long line, an identity that comes with obligations to the past, to the future, as well as privileges, the name, the network, the capital. Child psychologists who work with high wealth families note that this temporal identity is both a source of remarkable strength. It gives heirs a sense of purpose and groundedness that many of their peers lack, and a source of genuine psychological burden. The child who knows exactly who they are supposed to be and where they are supposed to fit, in a story that began before they were born, may find the navigation of their own individual identity considerably more complicated than a child whose self-definition is not loaded with this kind of historical freight. The institutions they build, architecture, designed for centuries. Old money's temporal philosophy expresses itself not only in financial instruments and child-rearing practices, but in the institutions it builds and supports. Institutions that are, by design, meant to outlast any individual lifetime by centuries. Consider the great universities. Harvard was founded in 1636, Yale in 1701, Oxford in 1096. These institutions were built with an explicitly multi-generational purpose, to perpetuate knowledge, civilization, and, candidly, the social order that their founders valued. The families that endowed their chairs, their buildings, their scholarship programs were not making investments in any conventional sense. They were making temporal statements. We intend to matter in 200 years. The same logic applies to the great cultural institutions, museums, symphonies, libraries, that bear the names of dynastic families. the Frick Collection in New York, the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, the Smithsonian, endowed by the bequest of James Smithson, an Englishman who never set foot in America but wanted his fortune to increase human knowledge among men. These institutions are not philanthropy in the modern sense of solving a problem. They are acts of temporal ambition, the desire to persist, to matter, to remain relevant across time horizons that no individual can inhabit. The Gothic architecture of the great prep schools and universities, deliberately built to look ancient even when new, is not mere aesthetics. It is a temporal argument rendered in stone. This institution belongs to the long run. It was here before you and will be here after you. When a student walks beneath stone arches that were built before their grandparents were born, they are receiving a lesson in institutional time that no classroom can replicate. Old money families have also been the primary patrons of institutions designed to preserve the past itself. Archives, historical societies, genealogical organizations, preservation trusts for historic buildings and landscapes. The National Trust in Britain, which preserves thousands of historic properties, landscapes, and coastlines, was founded in 1895 largely through the efforts of wealthy landowners who understood that the landscapes they cherished would be destroyed by industrialization unless someone institutionalized the obligation to preserve them. This is generational time expressed as conservation. What exists now must exist for those who come after. When old money's temporal philosophy fails, for all its sophistication, old money's relationship with time is not without its failures, and understanding where it breaks down is as instructive as understanding where it succeeds. The rigidity trap. The same orientation toward permanence and continuity that makes old money so durable can also make it catastrophically inflexible. The dead hand, so powerful as a preservative force, can become a stranglehold when the world changes in ways the original trust documents never anticipated. The history of the English aristocracy is full of families that held on too long, to landed estates that became economically unviable after World War I shattered the agricultural economy that had sustained them for centuries, to investments in industries that were being disrupted, to social positions that the 20th century was systematically dismantling. Families that could have adapted, sold the land, diversified the portfolio, reinvented the family's identity for a new era, instead watched their resources drain away in the maintenance of a structure that no longer made sense, because the cultural and legal mechanisms of the dead hand made adaptation feel like betrayal. The Great Country House Crisis in Britain, the demolition or institutional transfer of hundreds of aristocratic estates between 1900 and 1970, is in part a story of temporal philosophy failing to adapt. Families that had maintained their properties for 3 or 4 centuries found themselves unable to adjust their cost structures, unable to imagine alternative uses for their assets, and unwilling to make changes that their ancestors had not anticipated. The very rigidity that had preserved them across 2 centuries became the mechanism of their dissolution. The irrelevance of the past. Old money's deep reverence for the past can also produce a kind of ancestor worship that is more about legitimacy than genuine wisdom. Not everything the founders established deserves perpetuation. Not every value that was appropriate in 1880 is appropriate in 2026. Dynasties that cannot distinguish between the timeless lessons of their heritage and the merely historical preferences of their founders are dynasties that will eventually find themselves on the wrong side of history. The great Southern plantation families of America present a stark version of this failure. The temporal philosophy of those dynasties, the emphasis on continuity, the reverence for the land, the cultivation of a particular social order across generations, was built on a foundation of human enslavement that the passage of time could not legitimize. The values they were perpetuating were not merely outdated, they were monstrous. The multi-generational thinking that in other contexts produces resilience and stewardship was in this context the mechanism of prolonged injustice. This is the most serious critique of old money's temporal philosophy, that it can too easily become a justification for the perpetuation of arrangements that deserve to be dismantled. That we have always done it this way is not by itself a reason to continue, that the dead hand can grip injustice as tightly as it grips virtue. The dynasties that navigate this well are those with enough genuine intellectual honesty to distinguish between what in their heritage is worth preserving and what must be released. This requires, paradoxically, a willingness to subject the past to the present's judgment, a capacity for self-critique that sits in some tension with the deep reverence for continuity that old money culture otherwise encourages. What the rest of us can learn. We've spent most of this video inside the world of dynastic wealth, a world most of us will never inhabit. But old money's temporal philosophy contains lessons that are genuinely applicable beyond the context of dynasties and trust funds. The core insight is this: the time horizon you operate on shapes every decision you make. Extend your horizon, and your decisions change, not in small ways, in fundamental ways. An individual who thinks 5 years ahead makes different financial decisions than one who thinks 20 years ahead. A community that thinks 20 years ahead makes different infrastructure investments than one that thinks 50 years ahead. A civilization that thinks 50 years ahead makes different environmental decisions than one that thinks in electoral cycles. The planetary crises we now face, climate change, biodiversity loss, resource depletion, are at their deepest level failures of temporal philosophy. They are the consequence of billions of individual and institutional decisions made in transactional time, optimizing for the present at the expense of futures that seemed too distant to matter. Old money's insistence on generational time is, from this perspective, not merely a wealth preservation strategy. It is a model for the kind of thinking that any sustainable civilization must eventually adopt. The capacity to hold the future as seriously as the present, to feel genuine obligation to people not yet born, is not a luxury of the wealthy. It is, arguably, the most important cognitive and cultural shift the human species needs to make. The families that have maintained wealth and meaning across generations did so by taking the long view seriously enough to build it into their legal structures, their investment strategies, their child-rearing practices, and their institutional commitments. They made the future real, not as an abstraction, but as a living obligation. That is something any of us can practice, regardless of what we have to pass on. The strange way old money thinks about time is in the end less strange than it first appears. It is simply a fuller version of what all of us, at our best moments, already know to be true. That we did not make ourselves, that we owe something to those who came before, and that what we do now will matter to people we will never meet. The dynasties that last are not operating in some rarefied dimension inaccessible to ordinary human beings. They have simply taken one fundamental insight, that time is longer than a single life, and built everything around it. The grandfather clock in the library doesn't tell you what time it is right now. That's not what it's for. It is measuring something larger, the slow accumulation of moments into decades, decades into generations, generations into legacy. Old money learned to listen to that clock, and everything else they do follows from that. Subscribe and ring the bell. We go deep on topics most channels won't touch.